Today we're sharing 3 intense caving stories where things went terribly wrong. These tales are dramatized, but highlight real dangers underground. They're meant to remind us to always be careful, stay prepared, and respect the power of nature. Viewer discretion is advised. Story 1. The Vanishing River Cave Disaster. It was September 4th, 1967. 4 friends, Richard Bell, Douglas Evans, Ellsworth Rawls, and Lauren Ballinger, set out on an expedition to Vanishing River Cave, way out in the rugged Guadalupe Mountains. These guys weren't amateurs. They had years of experience between them. They'd done countless caves before, but this time things would go horribly wrong. The entrance to the cave sat high up on Milan Ridge, a spot known for its wild and unpredictable weather. Just the week before, storms had pounded the area, leaving the ground soft and unstable. The weather forecast mentioned the chance of another storm that day, but it seemed far enough off that the group figured they had time. So, they pressed on. Their descent started early. The cave had a massive 150-foot vertical drop, so they rigged their ropes carefully, triple-checking knots and equipment. When you're dropping straight down, there's no room for error. The walls were slick, the air was cold, and the only sounds were the hum of rope and the occasional drip of water. By mid-morning, they made it to the main chamber. It was huge. Their headlamps barely touched the far walls. They split up to explore smaller tunnels, moving quickly but cautiously. For the group, it felt like just another day. Steady teamwork. A few quiet jokes. Nothing unusual. Hours later, Evans decided to head back to the surface to check on the weather. "I'll take a look," he said, grabbing his climbing gear, "just in case." Now, if you've ever climbed a vertical shaft, you know it's slow, hard work. Every pull on the rope feels like a mini battle. Evans was about 20 feet from the top when he paused. Something wasn't right. The wind had shifted. The air outside carried that unmistakable smell. Rain. Evans hauled himself the last few feet and froze. Dark clouds had swallowed the sky, and a sharp gust of wind tugged at him. "The storm's here!" he yelled, his voice echoing back down into the cave. The guys below barely heard him. They were packing up, tying gear together, and didn't notice the faint tremor in the ground. A warning. Rawls glanced up, frowning. "Did you feel that?" "It's probably nothing," Lauren muttered. And then it happened. The low rumble turned into a sharp crack, like ice breaking, but louder. Rocks shifted above and stones started raining down the shaft. "Move!" Richard shouted. Evan's voice cut through the chaos. He was shouting something, but the words were lost in the noise. Then there was a loud crash, a sound no one would ever forget. Silence followed. Richard, Rawls, and Lauren froze. The chamber felt unnaturally still. "Evans!" Richard shouted. Nothing. Rawls was the first to move. He grabbed the rope and descended quickly, his hands steady despite his racing heart. When he reached the bottom, what he saw made his stomach drop. Evans lay crumpled on the rock floor, his helmet cracked beside him. He was alive, but just barely. His breathing was ragged, and there was blood streaked across his forehead. "My back, my side," Evans groaned, his voice barely a whisper. Rawls dropped to his knees and checked him over. It was bad, probably a spinal injury. Richard and Lauren hovered nearby, their faces pale. "We need to get help," Rawls said firmly. Richard didn't hesitate. He grabbed the ropes and started the climb to the surface. But the storm had arrived in full force. Rain was pounding the mountainside, and the ropes hung heavy and slick with water. Richard fought through it, every inch of the climb a struggle. Meanwhile, Rawls and Lauren did everything they could to keep Evans alive. They wrapped him in spare clothes to keep him warm, talking to him to keep him conscious. Hours crawled by. The water dripping from the cave walls grew heavier, and the air was bone-chillingly cold. By 6:30 that evening, Evans' breathing faltered. Rawls sprang into action, starting CPR. "Come on, Evans, breathe!" he shouted, his hands shaking from exhaustion. Minutes turned to an hour. Rawls pushed himself until he couldn't anymore. Finally, he slumped back, his voice hoarse. "He's gone." There was no time to grieve. Water was pooling around them, and the cave felt like it was closing in. They had to get out, fast. "You go first," Ralls told Lauren. Lauren began the climb, but 30 feet from the top, his rope snapped. The line, weakened by rain, gave way, and Lauren swung hard into the rock wall. For a moment, he dangled there, dazed, but adrenaline kicked in. Gritting his teeth, he grabbed for a backup rope, secured it, and kept going. When Lauren finally crawled onto the surface, he collapsed into the mud, shaking from the cold and exhaustion. Rawls followed soon after, the two of them soaked, battered, and broken. Evans was still in the cave, unreachable. The storm raged all night, trapping them on the mountainside. By morning, when the skies cleared, they returned with a rescue team. It took hours to recover Evans' body. The cave's remote location, paired with the mud and debris, made the job agonizing. When the survivors finally reached the road, they were silent, pale, hollow-eyed. Vanishing River Cave had claimed one of their own that day, and it left them with a lesson they would never forget. No matter how skilled or prepared you are, nature is always in charge. Underground, even the smallest mistake can cost everything. Story 2. The Ice Crawl of Overholt Blowing Cave. Let me tell you about Overholt Blowing Cave. If there's one cave you don't want to mess with in winter, it's this one. Picture an underground labyrinth of freezing water, narrow passages, and damp, unrelenting cold. That's what Ralph Bucca and John Locke walked into on February 25, 1967. The day started off simple enough. Ralph and John were close friends and experienced cavers, enough to make them confident, but maybe a little too confident. Overholt had a reputation. Locals called it the Ice Box for a reason, and that was no exaggeration. Before they entered, they stopped by to talk to the landowner, Mr. McKeever. He was a grizzled old-timer, the kind of man whose warnings you really shouldn't ignore. "You boys really think you're ready for Overholt?" McKeever asked, his arms crossed as he leaned against his old woodshed. "I've seen men crawl in there thinking they're tough, but when that cold water hits you, it doesn't let go." Ralph laughed it off. "We've got this, McKeever. We're geared up." McKeever shook his head, giving them a hard look. "The water'll get in your bones, son. Cold sets in faster than you think. Don't say I didn't warn you." John gave a small wave, thanking him for the heads up as they headed toward the cave entrance. "We'll be back before dark," he called over his shoulder. McKeever didn't look convinced. The cave greeted them with an eerie stillness. Their boots echoed faintly as they stepped inside, the beams of their headlamps cutting through the darkness. The air grew colder the deeper they went, a biting chill that settled into their skin. At first, the pair navigated the cave with ease, crossing shallow streams and weaving through low passages. "Not bad so far," Ralph said, his voice bouncing off the walls. John nodded, though he noticed the temperature was dropping the farther they ventured in. "We'll see when we hit Dell's Passage." Dell's Passage. The name alone carried weight among local cavers. It was infamous, 500 feet of tight, crawling through water, so cold it might as well have been ice. And on that day, in the dead of winter, it was a death trap waiting to happen. When they reached it, Ralph didn't hesitate. "Let's get it done," he said, dropping to his hands and knees. The second he slid into the water, his breath caught. It was like 1,000 needles stabbing into his skin. He muttered through gritted teeth, "That's cold." John followed close behind. "Keep moving. The faster we're through, the better." But it wasn't that easy. The crawl was relentless. The water soaked through their layers almost immediately, leaving nothing between them and the icy chill. The cave walls pressed close around them, and every pull forward felt slower, harder. Ralph's breathing grew more labored. "John, how much further?" he asked, his voice trembling. "Halfway, I think. Just keep going," John replied, though even he wasn't sure. His arms burned, and the cold was starting to seep into him, too. By the time they finally crawled into the mountain room, a small chamber at the other end, Ralph was a mess. His hands were shaking, and his movements were sluggish. "Ralph, you okay?" John asked, crouching beside him. Ralph tried to nod, but his teeth were chattering. I can't feel my fingers." John frowned, alarmed. "Hypothermia. It was already setting in. We need to get out, now." Ralph groaned as he tried to stand, but collapsed back onto the wet ground. His legs were stiff, barely responding. "I don't think I can make it back, John." John crouched beside him, his mind racing. They were still deep in the cave, and Dell's passage, the icy tunnel they'd barely crawled through, was the only way out. There was no room for a rescue team, no shortcuts. It was up to John to get them both out. "Don't even think about quitting on me," John said firmly, grabbing Ralph's pack and pulling him upright. "We're going." Ralph didn't argue. He couldn't. He was barely conscious, his body refusing to cooperate. John slung one of Ralph's arms over his shoulder, supporting him as they moved back toward Dell's passage. The crawl back was pure agony. John had to drag Ralph through the freezing water, inch by inch. Every pull of Ralph's weight sapped his energy. His own limbs were burning, shaking from fatigue and cold, but he didn't stop. "Come on, Ralph, just hold on," John muttered under his breath, his voice cracking from the strain. "Almost there." Ralph didn't respond. His head lolled to the side, and for a moment John panicked. "Ralph!" He shook him. Ralph groaned faintly. It was enough to keep John moving. Finally, after what felt like hours, John dragged Ralph out of Dell's passage and into the main tunnel. The entrance was close now, but Ralph was unresponsive. His skin was pale, his lips tinged blue. John ripped off his wet gloves and pulled Ralph's drenched clothing off, replacing it with the driest layers he could find in their packs. It wasn't much, but it was all they had. Then, with the last bit of strength he could muster, John hoisted Ralph onto his back and carried him. The entrance came into view like a beacon. Light streamed faintly through the cave mouth, and John staggered forward, every step a battle. When they finally broke through to the freezing air outside, John collapsed into the snow, gasping for breath. But there was no time to rest. Ralph was slipping away. John spotted McKeever's shed nearby. He dragged Ralph inside, throwing dry blankets over him and lighting the small wood stove in the corner. Ralph's body barely stirred, his pulse faint. John bolted for McKeever's house, sprinting through the snow, his lungs burning. "Help! We need help!" McKeever didn't waste time. Together they rushed back to the shed, carrying heated blankets, water bottles, anything they could use to warm Ralph. Hours passed as they worked to save him, rubbing his limbs, wrapping him in layers of warmth, talking to him to keep him tethered to life. Finally Ralph stirred. His eyes fluttered open, and he looked up at John weakly. "You, got me out?" John smiled, his face pale from exhaustion. "Yeah, don't make me do that again." McKeever, shaking his head, muttered, "You boys are lucky you didn't freeze solid." For Ralph, the experience was humbling. The cold had almost claimed his life, and the cave had taught him a lesson he would never forget. You don't mess with Mother Nature. As for John, that day proved that sometimes sheer willpower and determination can make the difference between life and death. Overholt Blowing Cave might have let them out that day, but it made sure they understood just how unforgiving it could be. Story 3. Big Ridge Cave's Collapse. Let me take you to Pennsylvania in 1970, where 3 friends decided to tackle Big Ridge Cave, a sprawling underground system that had a reputation for being both breathtaking and dangerous. The cave was known for its twisting passages, unstable rock formations, and sheer drops, a place that tested even the most experienced cavers. The group that day was made up of Tom O'Halloran, 18 years old, the rookie of the team, O'Neill Orby, 24, steady and reliable, and Del Mays, 20, a seasoned caver who had explored countless caves across the region. For Tom, this was his first major expedition, and he wanted to prove himself. He idolized Del, who was the natural leader of the group, and O'Neill, whose calm demeanor made him feel safe. For all of them, this was supposed to be an exciting day underground, just another adventure. The weather that morning was perfect. Clear skies, cool air, and not a single sign of rain. They packed their gear carefully, helmets, headlamps, ropes, harnesses, first aid kits, and enough food to last a day. Tom couldn't hide his excitement as they approached the cave's entrance, a narrow, jagged opening hidden by overgrown brush. "This is it?" Tom asked, staring into the dark mouth of the cave. Del grinned, adjusting his harness. "Yeah, Don't let the entrance fool you. Big Ridge is no joke. Stick close and watch your footing, O'Neill added, his tone more serious. Take your time. We've got all day. The descent into Big Ridge started off easy. The first tunnels were wide and relatively flat, with water trickling along the floor and glistening stalactites hanging overhead. Their headlamps cut sharp beams through the darkness, illuminating the cave's natural beauty. Tom, trailing behind, couldn't help but whisper, "This place is incredible." "It gets tighter the deeper we go," Dell called back. "Stay sharp." After an hour, the cave began to change. The tunnels narrowed, forcing them to crawl on hands and knees through low passages. The air grew colder and heavier, and the sound of dripping water echoed all around them. At one point, Tom looked back and realized the entrance was long out of sight, nothing but darkness behind him. "You okay back there?" O'Neill asked, noticing Tom's hesitation. "Yeah, I'm good," Tom replied quickly, though his heart was pounding a little harder now. This was unlike anything he'd experienced before. After navigating a few smaller drops and squeezes, the group reached the fissure. It was a narrow crack in the rock that sloped sharply downward into darkness. The only way forward was to descend carefully, one at a time, using ropes for safety. O'Neill went first, moving with practiced precision. "It's stable," he called up. "Just slippery. Watch your footing." Dell followed next, his headlamp bobbing as he moved methodically down the slope. When he reached the bottom, he looked up at Tom. "Your turn." Tom took a deep breath and gripped the rope tightly. He'd done smaller climbs before, but something about the steep, slick slope made his nerves flare. He eased himself into the fissure, his boots scraping against the damp rock. The walls felt close around him, and the cold air made it hard to focus. "You're doing fine, Tom," Dell said, his voice echoing faintly. Tom nodded, forcing himself to keep moving. But halfway down, his boot slipped. "Whoa!" he yelped, his grip on the rope tightening as he slid a few feet. His heart pounded in his chest, and for a moment, he froze. "You're good," O'Neill called up. "Just take it slow. You've got this." Tom nodded, swallowing hard. He adjusted his footing and kept going. But just as he neared the bottom, the rock beneath his boot crumbled. Before he could react, Tom lost his balance. His hand slipped off the rope, and gravity took over. He crashed against the wall, bouncing off jagged rock before landing hard with a sickening thud. The cave fell silent. "Tom!" Dell's voice cut through the darkness, sharp with panic. Tom groaned, his vision blurring. His knee throbbed with intense pain, and when he tried to move, he cried out. Something was wrong. Very wrong. Dell and O'Neill rushed to his side, their headlamps revealing the damage. Tom's pant leg was soaked with blood, and a deep gash ran along his kneecap. His face was pale, and his breathing was quick and shallow. "Let me see it," O'Neill said, crouching beside him. He carefully inspected the wound, his expression grim. "It's deep. He's losing blood." "I can climb," Tom mumbled, though his voice was weak. "No chance," Dell said firmly. "We're getting you out of here." Getting Tom back to the surface was going to be a nightmare. The fissure they'd just descended wasn't wide enough for them to carry him out easily, and the rest of the cave was filled with tight squeezes and sharp drops. They had no choice but to rig a makeshift harness and hoist him upward inch by inch. Dell took charge of the ropes, anchoring them securely. O'Neill stayed with Tom, keeping him calm and steady. "Hang in there, kid," O'Neill said softly. "We're going to get you out." The climb began. Dell and O'Neill worked together to pull Tom up, one painstaking inch at a time. Every movement sent fresh waves of pain through Tom's knee, but he gritted his teeth and stayed quiet, knowing his friends were doing everything they could. The fissure felt endless. Dell's muscles burned from the strain of holding the rope steady, and O'Neill's hands were raw from guiding Tom upward. Every few minutes, they paused to check the knots, double-checking their safety. "Almost there," Dell called down, though his voice was tight with exhaustion. When they finally reached the top, all three of them collapsed onto the rocky floor, breathing hard, but the fight wasn't over yet. They still had to navigate the rest of the cave, a series of narrow tunnels and smaller climbs, before they could reach the surface. Let's keep moving, O'Neill said, helping Tom sit up. We'll take it slow. For the next few hours, they moved carefully. Dell and O'Neill carried Tom through the tight passages, dragging him when they had to, guiding him over rocks and through squeezes. The cave felt endless, each turn revealing yet another challenge. Tom's condition worsened as they went. His face was pale, his breathing shallow, and his knee had swollen to twice its normal size. Dell and O'Neill pushed through, their determination the only thing keeping them going. At long last, they saw it, the faint glow of daylight, filtering through the cave's entrance. The sight filled them with relief. "We're there," Dell breathed. Together they pulled Tom through the final stretch and out into the sunlight. All three of them collapsed onto the damp grass, utterly spent. The cool air felt unreal after so many hours underground. O'Neill was the first to move. "Let's get him to a hospital." Dell nodded, sitting up to check on Tom. "You made it, kid." Tom, weak but conscious, managed a faint smile. "Told you I could climb." At the hospital, doctors stitched Tom's knee and told him he'd need weeks to recover. He was lucky. A fall like that could have been far worse. For Tom, the experience was humbling. He'd learned the hard way that even one small mistake in a cave can spiral into disaster. For Dell and O'Neill, it was proof of something they already knew. Teamwork and level-headed thinking can mean the difference between life and death underground. Big Ridge Cave let them go that day, but not without leaving its mark. And for those three cavers, the lesson was one they'd carry forever. No cave, no matter how beautiful, is worth underestimating.